Coming up on Dare to Love, Muslims reject the idea that Jesus is the Son of God. Samya will help us understand why that is as she looks at what the Quran teaches. Also today, the number of Muslims coming to the West is rapidly growing. What are the factors contributing to the growth? Samya answers this and some of your questions about Islam next. Now here's Samya.
Hi, I'm Samya Johnson, bringing you a new way to think about the Muslims you know. Why do you think Muslims reject Jesus as the Son of God? God neither begets nor is begotten. This is what the Quran teaches. But what exactly do Muslims know about the term Son of God? Are they reading more into it, misinterpreting it, and thus fighting hard against it? That's what we will unveil today so that we can help our Muslim neighbors overcome this huge stumbling block that prevents them from believing in the Son of God, Jesus Christ. Author Ken Crockett wrote in his book, I Once Was Blind, But Now I Squint, the person who won't change his mind to line up with the truth will change the truth to line up with his mind. For centuries, people believed the sun revolved around the earth. They had proof the sun rose in the east and set in the west, and it looked so much smaller compared to our planet. Scientists flinched when Nicolaus Copernicus suggested the earth revolved around the sun. It never occurred to them that their perspective might be wrong. But then truth prevailed and people corrected their perspectives to line up with the facts. St. Augustine said, before God can deliver us, we must undeceive ourselves. Muslims need to be undeceived. They need to know the true meaning of why Jesus is the Son of God.
The expression Son of God has been used historically with an incorrect meaning. People misuse the term to serve their own beliefs. Human or part-human offspring of deities are very common in other religions and mythologies. For example, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh claimed to be of both human and divine descent. Another well-known son of a god and a human is Hercules. A great many pantheons included genealogies in which various gods descended from other gods, and so the term son of a god was applied to many deities. Throughout history, emperors and rulers in diverse cultures assumed titles that reflect their close relationship with deities. The title Son of Heaven was first used by the Emperor of China. The first emperor of Japan was called Jimmu Tenno, which means the Son of Heaven. In ancient modern history, emperors used the title a Son of God. For example, Roman Emperor Augustus referred to himself as Divi Filius, meaning son of a god, as did Julius Caesar. In Greek mythology, Heracles and many other figures were considered sons of gods from Zeus. Around 360, Alexander the Great implied he was a demagogue by using the title Son of Ammon Zeus. Almost 650 years after Christ's time, Muhammad, the founder of Islam, incorrectly believed that Christians claimed Jesus as the Son of God in the same way kings and emperors of the past claimed the title for themselves. That's why the phrase Son of God is so offensive to every Muslim. The idea of God having a son is considered blasphemous. Muslims are usually ready with a response. You hear them say, Allah is above all attributes that show any shortcomings. Allah does not need to be a father, so he cannot have a son. If Allah has a son, this means there is a being who is like him, and that is not acceptable. The Quran teaches that Allah is unique. He has not fathered anyone, nor was he fathered, and there is nothing comparable to him. Also, it is not befitting to the majesty of God that he should beget a son. Glory be to him. When he determines a matter, he only says to it, be, and it is. Sure, people have children, but not Allah. How could he be a father? Isa is the son of Mary, but definitely not the son of God. Allah has a son? This is blasphemy.
There are two basic misunderstandings that lead Muslims to reject Jesus as the Son of God. They think Christians believe that Jesus came as the result of a physical relationship between God and Mary, and that Jesus was a human who became God. So if we deal with both misconceptions, we may help our Muslim friends realize that their supposition was incorrect all along. Let's start with the first Muslim misperception, that Jesus was born as the result of a physical union between God and Mary. Muslims always use the verse that I quoted in the beginning, which says, "He is Allah, the One, He begetteth not, nor was begotten." This verse clearly states that God has no children. He is not begotten and He does not beget sons. The Quran gives a reason for that in another verse. How can He have a child when there is for Him no consort or no partner? The problem with this verse and many others throughout the Quran is that Muhammad misunderstood what the term Son of God meant according to the Bible. He thought of son only in terms of sexual reproduction and concluded that Christians claim that God fathered a child with Mary. Muhammad was unable to distinguish between Jesus as the Son of God and the Arab pagan belief that idols were the offspring of gods. In the 6th century, during Muhammad's time, there were 3 main idols in Mecca that were worshipped: Allat, Al-Uzza, and Manat. They were known as daughters of the supreme pagan god Hubal. Muhammad thought that Christians related to the Son of God in the same way the Arab pagans understood their idols. This was the reasoning behind the verse in Surah 9 that says, "The Christians say the Messiah is the Son of God. This is a saying from their mouths. May Allah destroy them. How are they deluded?" We must confirm to the Muslim that we reject the idea that God had a physical relationship with Mary. That is blasphemy for any Christian. Explain the father-son relationship between God the Father and Jesus Christ is achieved by the gracious choice of the Father and the faithful obedience and service of the Son, and not by creation, and certainly not by procreation.
Don't go anywhere. Samya will be right back after this short break.
Learn more about our ministry on our website, daretolove.tv. You'll find a number of helpful, free resources, including online books and articles, as well as our radio and television programs. And why not check out our online store with all of the tools you need to get started reaching out to Muslims in your neighborhood. And feel free to contact us with your comments and questions. We'd love to hear from you. It's all on our website, daretolove.tv. daretolove.tv.
At Call of Love Ministries, we want to thank our Dare to Love viewers who continue to give generously to help Syrian and Iraqi refugees in their time of need. Through our partner churches in Lebanon and Jordan, your donations have provided food, medicine, clothing, winter blankets, and cleaning supplies to thousands of displaced people. More importantly, the Word of God is transforming the lives of these people. Many Muslims are coming to know Christ as Lord and Savior because of the love shown to them through the refugee centers.
شكرا لهالناس، بس إن كان ساعدونا بكاسة الحليب، بحبة الرز، بحبة السكر اللي وصلت لنا، في البطانيات اللي تدفوا فيها عالم، اللي ناس كان ما عندها تنام، اللي دخلت الشتاء وبلشت تبكي. أنا الوحدة، أنا أجرت بيت فاضي، كان أعطي الدوشق اللي عندي لأولادي، وأنا كنت أنام على منشفة الحمام. وعن جد يثبتوا لنا إيش قدر الرب يحبنا. الله يحبنا، عم يفرجي محبته لنا من خلال هالأشخاص.
New refugees come daily to these centers and their needs are great. Please consider giving a monthly donation. $30 a month, just $1 a day, will make an eternal impact. Join us in reflecting God's love to Iraqi and Syrian refugees. Call us now at 832-220-4040 or visit our website, daretolove.tv. daretolove.tv.
The second Muslim misconception is that Jesus was a human who became a god. Muslims think that Jesus was a human and Christians made him to be equal to God. The Quran states this in a conversation in Surah 5 when it says, "And when Allah will say, O Isa, son of Maryam, did you say to men, take me and my mother for two gods besides Allah? He, Isa, will say, Glory be to thee. It did not befit me that I should say what I had no right to say. If I had said it, thou wouldst indeed have known it." We must emphasize to our Muslim friend quite clearly that Jesus is not a man that became God, but God became man through Jesus Christ. The Bible says, by common confession, great is the mystery of godliness. He who was revealed in the flesh was vindicated in the spirit, seen by angels, proclaimed among the nations, believed on in the world, taken up in glory. So we believe that the eternal Son of God is one with the Father from all eternity, united to him in one spirit. Here, the Muslim might ask, so did God stop being God when he was on earth for 33 years? Make sure to confirm that God did not give up being God in order to become man in the form of Jesus. When Jesus was on earth, God continued to be omnipresent. He was still everywhere. In fact, God spoke from heaven when Jesus was in the flesh. A voice came out of the cloud to tell the 3 disciples who were with Jesus on the mountain, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." It's important to confirm to the Muslim that Jesus existed before the beginning of time and that he appeared in the flesh at a certain historical time. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. I know it's not easy to explain why Jesus is called the Son of God, but once we make clear the 2 main misconceptions and confirm to the Muslim that we do not believe that Jesus was born as the result of a physical union between God and Mary, and we do not believe that Jesus was a man who became God, we will have covered a lot of ground. But we still need to answer one more important question that every Muslim will ask. I will unveil it right after this short break.
Why do Muslim women cover their heads? Do all Muslims really have to pray in Arabic, even if they don't speak Arabic? The more you look into Islam, the more questions you'll likely have. Get all of your questions answered by Samya right here on Dare to Love. Just email your questions to ask@daretolove.tv. ask@daretolove.tv.
Muslims have lived in non-Islamic countries for centuries. Like any new immigrants, they first settled in the larger cities. But in the last few decades, Muslim families and businesses have started to move to suburbs and small towns. There are 4 major factors for the growth of the Muslim population in non-Islamic countries. Immigration is one of them. Muslims leave their home countries seeking the free world for higher education, for a better quality of life, and a better future for their children. Birth rate is another factor for growth. Muhammad encouraged his followers to spread Islam through childbearing. So it's not uncommon for Muslim families to have 4 or more children, more than twice the average number of children in most non-Muslim families. A third main factor that helps Islam's growth is marriage between Muslim men and non-Muslim women. Quite often, Muslim men come to the West as students, on business or on tourist visas, with the intent to marry in order to acquire legal citizenship. Thousands of non-Muslim women marry Muslim men each year, and most of them will eventually convert to Islam to please their husbands, to keep their children, and to save their marriage. Another factor that serves the growth of Islam in the West is conversion. Muslim missionaries and clerics spread Islam in prisons, schools, colleges, and through special cultural events that they lavishly fund. Some mosques in North America and Europe report an average of 50 to 100 converts every year. These reports might be discouraging for you. But the good news is that millions of Muslims all over the world are experiencing the saving grace of Christ every day. God is using radio, TV, satellite, and the internet to penetrate the hearts and to bring salvation to the lost in the Islamic countries. Also in the West, Muslims have the freedom, many for the first time, to think for themselves. So we as Christ followers have a responsibility to witness to our Muslim neighbors. The Great Commission that Jesus gave us to be witnesses is a commandment we have to live and practice. Muslims are included in this commission, and God is bringing Muslims to live in our neighborhoods from all over the world. So what do? To reach Muslims, we have to learn about them, explore their doctrines, unveil their religious practices, and take a closer look at their culture and traditions. And then we can find out what we have in common with them so that we can build on it. Jesus said, "I have other sheep which are not of this fold. I must bring them also, and they will hear my voice, and they will become one flock with one shepherd." If you just tuned in, welcome. You're watching Dare to Love, where we learn more about our Muslim neighbors in order to witness to them effectively. Our topic today is about the Muslims' refusal to confess Jesus as the Son of God. That's because of all the misconceptions the Quran teaches about the subject. We already unveiled how we can help our Muslim friend correct their understanding that Jesus, the Son of God, was not born as the result of a physical union between God and Mary, and that he was not a man who became God. Now, the next logical question that follows for the Muslim to ask is, why then is Jesus called the Son of God? This does not make sense to me. First, we have to explain that the expression Son of God is an analogical term. It indicates origin, a close association or identification. In Christian theology, it describes the relationship of two persons of the triune God. It expresses an intimate relationship between these two persons, God the Father and Jesus the Messiah. You can give them Muslim examples from other languages that use this term. For example, in Egypt, Egyptians call themselves sons and daughters of the Nile. Does this mean that the Nile got married and had children? A familiar example also for Muslims is Ibn Sabil, son of the road, which simply means a traveler or voyager. Another example with which many are familiar is the son of Satan, used to vividly describe any mischief maker. Obviously, Satan does not have a wife in order to have a son. The name implies that the mischief maker is like Satan, an embodiment of Satan, a Satan with us. Now, God chose to describe the relationship between himself and Jesus as a father-son relationship because it's a term we can understand and relate to. But in truth, the father-son relationship between God the Father and God the Son is much stronger and deeper than we can comprehend. But we cannot stop here. We need to emphasize that the expression Son of God is used to describe the Messiah as a royal son who rules with his father. For a child will be born to us, a son will be given to us, and the government will rest on his shoulders, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace. The term Son of God with reference to Jesus is as unique as the relationship it expresses. Jesus said, "I and the Father are one." That's why Jesus, the Son of God, was able to reconcile us with himself. He had the authority and the ability to do that because he and the Father are one. Up until now, you've only heard from me about this subject. So how about we hear from various Bible teachers, pastors, and scholars who have been faithful Christ followers for decades? Let's hear what the term Son of God means to them according to the Bible. After that, we will offer you a great resource that will help you answer the main questions, which are stumbling stones to almost every Muslim.
The book of Genesis begins with the statement, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." And John begins with the same words, John chapter 1, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." Now that's a very difficult thing for us to understand. How is it possible to say that Jesus was with God and at the same time was God? But John continues to explain this in chapter 1, and he says that this Word, who was with God and was with God in the beginning, this Word, John 1:14, this Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. So he was like one of us. He condescended to become a human being like we are, so that he could be dwelling among us, as it is put here. And then John 1:14 goes on to say, "We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth." So Jesus is the Son of God in the sense that he came from the Father, though not in a physical sense. God the Father was not his physical father. It's kind of a metaphor.
The Son of God is just the physical representation of the Holy God that created us and made a plan from the very beginning for us to be in relationship with him. That was his whole desire, is that we would be in a relationship with him, that not we would ever follow a set of laws or obey a God that we couldn't imagine, but that we would be in relationship. So the Son of God came to be in relationship with those he lived among and to teach us forevermore what it looks like to relate with him. So having a relationship with the Son of God is the same as becoming literally face to face with the holy God of creation.
As I think of explaining Jesus as the Son of God, I think back to the Old Testament scriptures, which talked about the owner of the vineyard sending his son and his representative. And so God sent his representative, his chosen son. And so the Son of God is one dimension. But I also think it's important that he also called himself the Son of Man. And so there we see the picture in Daniel of the Father on the throne and the Son coming towards the throne, and the Father calling him, Daniel seeing him as one who looked like the Son of Man. And he would be given all authority and all dominion, and his kingdom would last forever. And so I see that picture, and I see a Father and a Son. And Jesus is the Son of God.
The Son of God is, we think of it in terms of human family and body and flesh, as opposed to the expression of God coming to earth to be like us, to respond to us, to love us, to lead us to God the Father. So it's that expression to us that he empathizes and sympathizes with us, because it says in Hebrews, we do not have a Savior who is unable to feel our feelings the way he does. So the Son of God feels our feelings and takes them to the Father and redeems them. So it's not as though he's a separate human being and God's another human being and the Spirit's another human being. We don't believe in three gods. We believe in one God expressed in these different ways.
Reaching out to Muslims can be difficult if you don't know where to start or what to say. Well, now you can have all the resources you need in one toolkit, Dare to Connect. Dare to Connect has a simple one-year outreach plan you can follow using the many resources we've included. Muslim apologetics pamphlets, a DVD of former Muslims' testimonies, the Jesus Film movie in 16 languages, and much more. Start a one-year journey of witnessing to your Muslim friend. Get your toolkit today. Call us at 832-220-4040. To order online, visit our website, daretolove.tv. daretolove.tv.
It's time to answer some of the questions we received from you. The first question says, what are the main differences between the Sunnis and the Shiite? The Sunnis follow traditional or orthodox Islamic teachings and practices. They pray 5 times a day and practice the 5 pillars. Almost 90% of Muslims worldwide are Sunni. Shia Muslims have only 3 daily prayers, and the content of their prayers is a little different from Sunnis. They also have some different hadith and believe there are hidden meanings to the Quran beyond the literal meaning. Shia Muslims believe in praying at the tombs of certain saints who they believe can intercede for them. For Sunnis, any true Muslim can be a spiritual leader and ruler, but with Shia Muslims, the leader is a permanent, infallible manifestation of Allah and a perfect interpreter of the Quran. An example would be Ayatollah al-Khomeini of Iran. The other major difference between the two sects is that Sunni Muslims believe that the Mahdi, or the final successor to Muhammad, will come in the future. But the Shia sect believes that he already lived on earth and is currently the hidden Imam who works through the spiritual leaders to interpret the Quran and will return at the end of time. Another difference is the temporary marriage, which was practiced during Muhammad's time. Most Sunnis don't practice it, while the Shia still practice temporary marriage, even for 1 hour sometimes. We've covered a lot of ground today. I hope you feel ready to explain to your Muslim friend or anyone what the term Son of God means and what it does not mean. The Lord wants us to search the Bible to get answers, and that's what we should do. Anytime we have doubts or when someone asks us a question that we have not thought through before. If you would like to watch the episode again or share it with your Christian friends, send us an email to this address you see on the screen, and for any amount the Lord puts on your heart to contribute to this ministry, we will send you a copy. Next time we meet, we will continue to expose truths and misconceptions so we can better know our Muslim neighbor. And until then, I dare you to love your Muslim friend. Goodbye.
Thank you for watching Dare to Love. In learning about true Islam, we can protect our children from the westernized version of Islam and with Christ's help, boldly witness to our Muslim neighbors. If you've been blessed by what you've heard today, we would like to give you the opportunity to partner with us. Call the number on your screen right now or visit our website. Dare to Love is a production of Call of Love Ministries, a Christian nonprofit organization. All contributions are tax deductible. Donate online at calloflove.org. That's calloflove.org. Or call us at 832-220-4040. That's 832-220-4040. You can also send a check to Post Office Box 498698, Cincinnati, Ohio 45249 USA. Together, we can make an impact in God's kingdom.
Dare to Love is made possible by the friends and partners of Call of Love Ministries.